Looking back now, I realized that, I wanted to help people all along, and I thought being a doctor, I could help patient by patient. But working in conservation, sustainability, and climate, I realized that you can help families, you can help communities, you can help societies, you can help humanity. And to this day, people say, "Are you a nature lover?" And I say, insofar as it helps humans. I'm more a humanist than a naturalist. And the whole purpose of what I do and what we're talking about, climate change, sustainability, is not about the Earth surviving. The Earth's going to be fine. It's about humanity surviving and persisting on this planet.
The climate conversation has never been more divided. As disruptors in this space, we're hungry to find solutions to the challenges our environment faces. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. My name is Joel Caesar. I'm joined by Owen Barrett and Chris Pomerleau. We are experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. We celebrate those who take action against the climate crisis and are striving to make the world a cleaner place. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast. Joining me, as always, is the real estate oracle of Omaha, Chris Pomerleau, the self-proclaimed Adam Newman of Green Building, Owen Barrett, and of course myself, the world's greatest climate podcast host. Today's guest was Hari Balasubramanian. He's a proven sustainability expert who is driven by the belief that capital can be deployed to achieve commercial and impact returns. He's a brilliant guy. Owen and I have been chatting with him for years about trying to get him and his investors to invest with us. He's a great person to have on your side. He's super articulate, wealth of experience across the world, from NGO management to innovating new impact financing models. And, I think our guests are going to enjoy the knowledge, as we always have. What do you guys think?
I loved it.
Yeah, I thought
he's great. I think he and I get along really well because we both have a similar start where we were both in nonprofits and kind of understood that there's a better way to do philanthropy. Like, you can accomplish the same mission in a capitalistic model, which is ultimately going to be more successful than philanthropy. So I definitely vibe with him there.
But he started at Oxford.
I did not study at Oxford.
There's the difference. I think it's awesome to see the information he was able to provide to us, because we always talk about how we want to see this positive progression of what the world or financial sector is, how they view climate change, and to hear the meetings and the platforms and the information where he's gathering his information from, whether it's from the private sector or the not-profit or whatever, to hear him and that information and still stay positive, because we always fight hard, right, to stay optimistic, and we're doing what we can, but to hear him stay positive or remain positive and provide the information he did in the podcast is certainly enlightening and hopeful. It helps me remain hopeful.
Hopeful. Yeah, it's a good one.
It's a great theme for the show that we got to continue to amplify. But before we get into Hari, we're going to dive into a popular segment we've done before. We like to call Zero Bullshit. So I'm going to tee up a recent tweet by Elon Musk, and we're going to get Owen's take on it first and then see what you all think. So recently, Elon had a pretty controversial tweet. It was in response to someone else's tweet about climate. And Elon said, important to note that what happens on Earth's surface, e.g. farming, has no meaningful impact on climate change. Then he goes on to say, overwhelmingly, the risk of climate change is due to moving billions of tons of carbon from deep underground into the atmosphere. So it's controversial because he takes that first sentence and basically dismisses farming, agriculture, food as a significant contributor to the climate crisis, which is why he's getting a lot of flack from the environmental community that was misinformation. But I come away thinking it's positive that Elon, who is become sort of a fan of, or he's a fan favorite, he's a hero of the conservative community, who we might associate typically with lack of desire to move on climate. Elon, as we know, someone who started and has done more for the climate crisis than any entrepreneur, arguably, with what he's built at Tesla and some of his other companies, continues to double down to say, okay, everyone in the world who's following me, who now thinks I'm on your side as a conservative, I still believe climate change is a really significant challenge we have to solve. So I come away thinking, thank you, Elon, for saying that publicly on Twitter, where all your audience, this new audience now can get reaffirmed from you, someone they believe in, that this is something that we have to galvanize around as a society. But then, as everything in climate, it's complicated because he takes a shot at farming and land use. And I think we will hear from Owen here that maybe that's not completely accurate. What do you think, Owen?
Well, I don't want to get on Elon's bad side. I bought a Tesla in 2017 before it was cool. So I like Elon. Obviously, he's a smart dude. Ton of impactful companies, but I think Elon is guilty of living in the or world that so many people do. This whole solutions to climate change it's gray area. It takes everything. And I think just brushing aside farming and agriculture as not important is not helpful. 2018, 17% of global greenhouse gas emissions came from farming and agriculture. 17%, that's a lot. So to brush 17% off, I think, is not a good idea. The other thing to me that's really scary with agriculture in particular is the correlation between GDP growth and meat consumption and how bad meat is for the planet. And so if you look at the BRIC countries, so if you look at the US, we consume on average 128 kilograms per person per year in meat. Brazil's at 99, China's at 62, Russia's at 77, and India's only at 5. So if those 4 other countries get to the level of the US in terms of meat consumption as their economies grow, that 17% is going to be a lot bigger. So I think, I don't know. I don't agree with it. I think you're a person like Elon, you got to be more careful about what you're tweeting because a lot of people look up to him, take his, his thoughts as a gospel. And I think he was a little off base with this one, but still a fan of Elon.
I mean, the problem with that is that, I guess where I push back a little bit is him having to think about what he says. I think he's trapped in this, leading these companies trying to maximize profit while also trying to be like the world's most number one advocate for free speech. So it's really difficult to hush him up. I don't really necessarily think, I don't think he makes a lot of decisions based upon whether it's going to hurt or help him. I've seen him interviewed recently, and it's just very interesting to hear him say, if they don't like it, they can deal with it. But I guess with all that said, I mean, I think you should be careful because we want him to be careful because we want a good outcome. I question if he said that basically because it would benefit his businesses, certainly Tesla, if we focused our attention on driving electric vehicles as opposed to focusing our attention on cutting out meat from our diet. I don't know why he said it. Good luck figuring out what's in his head. But it certainly benefits his business if we all say, well, instead of cutting out meat, we will all drive electric vehicles. If you could snap your fingers right now, that's the other 83%, right? I don't have the figures. I'm just saying. So I certainly think we should be aware of the agriculture. I think there's certainly ways. Well, here's a question for you guys right now. And I don't know if we know this, but like everyone jokes about cow farts, but what if you actually had the majority or significant portion of agriculture being driven by, not literally, or actually it's actually literally, but by some type of electrical energy. So, I mean, there's a lot of gasoline and fuel being used for these farming. And I'm curious if that's something that could integrate, because then you can work more on the automobile and that portion of the agriculture as opposed to cutting out meat. So I think it's interesting. Real quick. What I do love in that tweet is that professor's edit of his.
Yeah.
And
famous climate activist professor.
And it's great because after they made the edit, it was so much more, okay, Elon, I mean, you're right. It's not the huge portion of the climate issue, but it's worth talking about it. He just kind of crosses out. I think I like what that was done there.
Well, Chris, of the 17% of greenhouse gases that agriculture is responsible for, 39% is farts.
Farts? Here he comes with the data. You asked
which one?
He's going to know.
It's a lot. But what if you could trim that 61% down to 30 using some type of?
I think that's the challenge here. I'll finish with this position. You're dismissing the idea that there's solutions there, which you're getting to, Chris, right? Yes, there's a ton of ways that the greenhouse gas that come from food and agriculture can be improved, and there's a lot of really good things that if we implemented them, like regenerative agriculture, have these co-benefits, kind of like we learned about the ocean. When you do good things for the ocean, for the climate, it leads to better things for ecosystems. But food, it's interesting. At Google, I'm in a group that works on sustainability, and food is part of our group. We're in this group called Workplace Services. Food's a very important program at Google. So in my role as trying to help us achieve net zero across Google, food is in sort of my purview. And it's just, when you think about we're going to assign someone to say, your job is building electrification, your job is on-site renewable energy, your job is embodied carbon from concrete. Then you have to assign someone, your job is to try to get people to eat less meat, things that they enjoy doing, things that are part of their culture. So just this idea of, when you think about the climate movement in general, there's so much we need to do, so much that is low hanging fruit at this point. I worry that the narrative of, oh, look, here come the climate people. They're also coming for your meat. They're coming for your burger. They're coming for the thing that is more human than anything, your food, who you share it with, where it comes from, your traditions around it. And I think Elon's tweet, actually, we should give another nod to. He's been a vocal supporter of some, I don't know what's happening in the Netherlands, something with Dutch farmers. I think because of climate, the government is maybe going to shut down some farms, and there's been protests because of course, if you bought a farm a long time ago and your job and your livelihood depends on it, and now climate activists are saying you got to shut down, that's going to lead to a pretty visceral reaction. So I think, I guess I'm saying two things right now at once. Food is important. It's got a huge footprint. Eating meat, as Owen just described, that's that figure of India and where they're going if they do start eating meat, and other countries that are growing, they eat like Americans. Wow, what are we going to do to climate? It's really concerning. So we need solutions there. But also, I think I kind of agree with Elon. We got to stick the message to fossil fuels are the problem, not your burger right now. Eventually we'll get to it, and there's a lot of good companies working on it, and we got to continue to speak about eating the right way. We had Mona Van on this podcast talking a lot about climate friendly diets. So yeah, let's talk about it. Let's explore it. But I'm going to side with Elon on this one.
Which is siding with me, so I appreciate that.
I always side with you over Owen.
Fuck that.
All right. Well, that was fun. Let's jump into our conversation with Hari Balasubramanian. Hari Balasubramanian is a proven sustainability expert who is driven by the belief that capital can be deployed to achieve commercial and impact returns. Hari is the founder of the certified B Corporation EcoAdvisors, working with governments, corporations, foundations, and individuals on values-aligned and sustainable decision-making. The firm has influenced over $4 billion in sustainably oriented financing, helping protect threatened species, forests, oceans, and the people who depend upon them throughout the world. So, Hari, welcome to the Climate Rebels podcast.
I'm excited to be here. Hi, everyone.
All right, we like to get right to work. We start every guest with the same question. How are you, a climate rebel?
I love you start each of these episodes with the same question. And I thought long and hard about this. I think it's going to come up a couple of times in the conversation because my career's zigged and zagged a bit, but I'm going to start right in the beginning. So Owen, Joel, we met each other, I think, over 15 years ago. And I was working at Conservation International at the time. I've been working in sustainability for over 2 decades. People often assume I was a little kid chasing after frogs and was a sustainability nerd and a tree hugger. But I literally fell into my job off the side of the boat, ass backwards. See, I was supposed to be a doctor growing up. I thought I was going to help people in marginalized communities around the world, but med school wasn't for me. And in my undergrad, I was sitting my last semester of my last year in a political ecology class. My prof was Amanda Vincent, the world's leading expert in seahorses. And the only reason I was sitting in the class is because she gave grades for attendance. And 2 weeks left into the semester, a PhD student walked in and was looking for a research assistant. And before she even explained what it was, I volunteered because I didn't want to get a real job. And it turned out the job, the research was on seahorses in southern Portugal. So I got to spend 8 hours a day with these magical creatures. Before then, I thought they were mythical. I thought they were like unicorns and incorruptible politicians, like mythical. But they're real and they're magical. They're little bony fish. They swim upright. They look like goofballs. They've got beady eyes, but they also are monogamous, and they share the same partner for life. Every mating season, they come together and they do this elaborate courtship ritual where they come and they dance every morning, eventually dancing so long up in the water column, and they do this spiral dance down where the female impregnates the male. It's the only family of animals where the male seahorse carries the fertilized eggs and gives birth to baby seahorses. And I got to spend 8 hours a day underwater watching this. And you think that's why my fascination with nature came to be. It was pretty cool. But the 8 hours a day, I wasn't underwater. I was with the coastal communities in southern Portugal. And what I learned was that they were dependent not on the seahorses, but on all the other stuff that the coastal area gave them. It was not only food and livelihoods, it was education, it was health, it was everything to them. And it was getting worse. And I quickly realized that the seahorses were not the coolest part of the story here. It was people and their dependence on nature. And looking back now, I realized that, I wanted to help people all along. And I thought being a doctor, I could help patient by patient. But working in conservation, sustainability, and climate, I realized that you can help families, you can help communities, you can help societies, you can help humanity. And to this day, people say, are you a nature lover? And I say, insofar as it helps humans, I'm more a humanist than a naturalist. And the whole purpose of what I do and what we're talking about, climate change, sustainability, it's not about the Earth surviving. The Earth's going to be fine. It's about humanity surviving and persisting on this planet.
So our first climate rebel, starting with a seahorse, I guess we got to acknowledge. And I just learned a lot about seahorses. Seem to be more sophisticated creatures than lawyers turned real estate entrepreneurs from Omaha.
Settle down.
It's diversity, though.
Hari,
Go ahead,
in your work with seahorses, because I've always wondered this, what is it that makes the male seahorse a male if it's the one that's giving birth? Wouldn't that make it a female in some degree?
In some degree, I suppose, genetically.
I've always had this question. I've known this. I've got a couple random facts in my head. One of them insists that seahorses, the male, gives birth. And I've always wondered why it's not considered the female, but maybe that's for a different podcast with your professor.
So it probably is with Amanda. And my wife always reminds me that I never got a PhD in biology. So I'm not the person to ask. I'm not a biologist. I'm just a conservationist.
We'll switch it back. We'll switch it back to sustainability.
Yeah, we'll find our way back to climate rebelliousness and real estate and entrepreneurship here. But Hari, thanks for the very cool story. And you mentioned meeting us. I don't know if you met Owen and when we were students at the Bren School in UC Santa Barbara. I know you and I met. That's where I think we connected this back as we were talking to you about our real estate venture idea a few years ago now. But yeah, Conservation International. I've been looking forward to ask you about this because I recall I was a grad student, and Owen and I have chatted about this a bunch on this podcast, how we met in graduate school where it was a very scientific focused management / physical science master's program at UC Santa Barbara. But he and I both went there with this goal to try to figure out how we could gain expertise in sustainability, but use business as the vehicle for change. And I remember when I was there, I had various ideas of how I was going to go about that. And one very cool thing about the Bren School was it gave you options. It gave you avenues to explore, you being one of them. I remember reading, what was the book now called? I think it was called Banker to the Poor. You know Banker to the Poor? It's about microfinance. Yeah. And I think I read that pre-grad school, but I went there thinking, I want to get into this potentially. I want to learn what's Conservation International doing about it. And I think I asked someone at the Bren School, hey, I want to learn more about how Conservation International gets involved in microfinance. And someone said, you should meet Hari. And I think that's how we met. So I guess, yeah, maybe you can bridge the gap here between seahorses and southern Portugal. When did Conservation International happen?
Yeah, sure. So from Portugal, I went to Barbados. Barbados, I went to Malaysia. Malaysia, I went to the Maldives, all on contract work. And eventually I got a master's degree at Oxford and applied for a job. I thought I'd be a marine conservationist. The job that happened was at CI, and the role was super fascinating. So they had been asked this question, you're one of the largest environmental nonprofits in the world. At that time, we were spending maybe $150, $200 million a year. We had 26 country programs, and we had 5 funds that invested in about 55 countries around the world. And they said, our donors are trying to ask what's happening. Like, how are we delivering conservation outcomes and societal outcomes? And it's fascinating. They didn't have a specific answer to that. So they hired me as a 25-year-old basically to go around the world, make sure everything that we did was mission aligned and that we could document and measure environmental and social results. So those 5 funds that I mentioned, 4 of them were grant making facilities, which is common for nonprofits. One of them was a debt finance facility, which is not that common. And it was the brainchild of Jennifer Moores, who was my first boss at CI, is now the CEO of the Nature Conservancy. And what Jennifer realized is that philanthropy can only go so far. If we're going to protect areas around the world, there's an opportunity cost, typically borne by the poorest and most marginalized people, which are the ones that are living in natural areas around the world. And if we don't compensate that opportunity cost with some enterprise development activity, we're doing them a disservice. And the long-term viability of those projects is not going to work out. So she built this concept to provide SME finance, small, medium-sized enterprise finance through loans. And the SME gap in the developing tropics is what we call the missing middle. They're unable to get debt from commercial sources. They have, specific needs for that debt. And particularly in areas like tourism or agriculture or sustainable harvesting, there's a lag between when you do activities and when you can sell your product. So there was a very clear gap, specifically in agriculture, small scale coffee production and cacao production, where short-term debt for harvest of a sustainable activity could bridge the gap between when the commodity was purchased by the end buyer, the offtake. So Verde Ventures was the name of the fund that she created. And it opened my eyes to a new world, which was, could we solve some of these problems, not just using, sinking capital through grants, but could we have a revolving fund or something that actually generates some revenue so we could recycle it and then scale?
Do you know, does that program continue today, that revolving loan? Has that been ongoing in perpetuity?
So it's been ongoing. Verde Ventures actually spun out into a larger fund, now managed by a German asset manager called Finance in Motion. And it's scaled up to provide mezzanine debt. So it works through intermediaries in Latin America and the Caribbean now. But it's been replicated through a variety of sources. So there's a series of harvest finance vehicles for sustainable agriculture. We've been working on similar concepts for small scale sustainable fisheries. The same concept can be applied for multiple asset classes and commodities. And it's not really micro, right? So we're not talking about $5,000 and $10,000 loans. We're talking about 50 to 250, upwards of $1 million where, commercial debt could be available for some of these actors, but it's either really hard to come by or it's really, really expensive. So if we can provide a source of that debt in a more subsidized way or a more amenable way while guaranteeing the offtake, it's fairly simple, but it's a very useful way to bridge the gap and allow for sustainable activities in that transition path.
Hari, I've always heard the default rates with microfinance are really low. Is it the same with these $50,000, $250,000, $1 million loans in similar spaces?
So like anything, this comes down to execution, right? So microfinance on the whole might be relatively low in terms of default rates for payment. In specific areas, though, it's quite high. And what happens is the expected return and the interest rates get so high to cover the default rate in certain areas. When I've heard situations in Southeast Africa, in Malawi in particular, where people were getting loans at 150% interest rates, which is asinine, right? Because the default rates were so high in that program. Our program was really interesting. We had a above 95% repayment rate. So it was highly successful. Very few defaults. The only time that I remember getting defaults were there was a project in El Salvador where the daughter of the farmer who owned the farm heard his daughter was kidnapped and had to pay ransom instead of satisfying the loan, which is a fairly good reason, I think, for defaulting all up.
Yeah.
That's
Gets you every time.
Well, I was going to say, Owen, it reminds me of how when we had the conversation with Jigger Shaw from the Department of Energy, and he had just on our show announced this major program that the DOE had secured with, I think it was Sunrun, and it was to help Puerto Rico specifically with some kind of debt. And I'll butcher it if I try to remember specifically. But his point to that was how, he was a really cool guest because he talked about all the innovative things he was trying to do at the Department of Energy with the Loan Program Office to allocate capital places that we needed to go. And historically, there are barriers that no longer make sense and need people like him, people like you, people like Conservation International, and the folks you just mentioned along the way that you worked with to create innovative solutions for impact finance. So I say that in a long way to say maybe there's a segue, Hari. I'm sure you're still doing this kind of work. Maybe you can tell us how you're applying all these lessons learned now.
Well, this is the second, I guess, rebellious story is that in 2012, I left the nonprofit world and started a business, which is the worst thing you can do as a tree hugger environmentalist, right? Go from philanthropy to the private sector. But the reason I did is because I totally sold out. But it's for scale. And the reason I did is because I heard this amazing number in 2011. So I was running around the world doing these projects, learning from a variety of people, indigenous people in the middle of the Amazon, the Congo Basin. I was learning from governments and at all levels. I was learning from conservation practitioners, community organizations across the board. And I was sitting at The Hague, and the European Commission put out a report in 2011 talking about the amount of global GDP being spent actively destroying the planet. And hazard to guess how much we spend collectively, globally, proportionally destroying the planet.
28.
Over 50%.
Wow.
Over 50% actively destroying. Not just passively, but actively destroying, right? At that time, that was about $45 trillion a year. And because I had such connectivity to the environmental community, I thought to myself, well, I work for one of the largest environmental nonprofits. TNC WWF are sitting beside us. The World Bank, we work with some of the largest family foundations. I did a quick back of the envelope. How much do we spend actively protecting the planet? And the number I came up with was $45 billion a year. That's 1,000 times less. And meanwhile, we had, Gordon Moore on our board. We had Howard Schultz on our board. We had Rob Walton on our board. We had Byron Trott, who was Warren Buffett's banker, on our board. And because I'd run around the world, and I live in California, I got to go to these board dinners and meetings and talk with them. And I'd say, thank you very much for coming to these gala dinners and writing your $100 million checks. But, you run some of the biggest businesses in the world. What's happening in your day job, and how is sustainability being integrated into what you're doing? And they didn't have a really good answer. So I took these things together. But the other thing they told me, though, was that we don't have a good answer, and it's really hard for us. Because when we think about sustainability, we go to places like this and the nonprofits, and they're really good about thinking on the sustainability side, but they don't understand our business. And when we go to our strategic consultants, they're really good about thinking about our business, but don't understand sustainability. So I took those things together and I said, well, why don't I build a strategic consulting business that does both, that has an authentic lens, a systems lens around the sustainability transition, but a commercial acumen to learning from that experience at Verde Ventures that we can use money and revolve it or make some revenue and profit out of it and think about the commercializing aspect. And that's how EcoAdvisors was born. So it's really filling the gap of strategic consulting advice to transition some of that 45 trillion that doesn't need to be destroying the planet, but they don't know any better. So we give them the advice and the pathway to spend that money in a more constructive way for the planet. And then evolving from there. So 10 years ago, the challenge was people didn't recognize that this is a pathway. Now we have all these commitments, people saying net zero by this date, I'm going to be nature positive. That trade-off question is less of a concern now. So we don't spend as much time arguing with people around whether it's possible or not. The gap that we see now is a product gap. And how do you allocate significant resources at scale to those transition pathways? So what we're doing to fill that gap now is the second business, which is EcoInvestors Capital, which is a product shop, an asset management business that's developing the scale products for the transition economy of the future. One of which we're talking about in real estate, right? Which is a clear pathway where we can decarbonize existing residential real estate, both multifamily and single family, generate superior returns than conventional real estate, and decarbonize 100% of the operating emissions. It's fantastic. It should be done. It's not being done at the scale it needs to. So we're building helping to build a pathway to allow institutional capital to take advantage of.
This is the part that excites me. Talk more about the real estate, the decarbonization. What are some of the ways you're implementing that?
Well, we're not. We're working with people that are experts in it, right? Like those sitting around the table here.
Yeah. What are some of the ways you're consulting through? Yeah.
So on the consulting side, we do a couple of things, right? So one is help our partners and the biggest real estate developers in the world understand that there's a pathway that doesn't need to be as destructive, both on the construction and the material side, as well as the operating efficiency side. So there are a series of choices you can make in the real estate sector, from breaking ground all the way through to operating your buildings. Some of which are in the extractive economy and many of which are in the future economy. So we help people understand what those decisions can look like at every step of the way and how to integrate that into their business model. The challenge with the large real estate developers at this point is that their value chains are, 3 to 7 years out. So while people say the technology doesn't exist, say on the material side today, that doesn't quite matter because emerging technology on cement and steel, which are the largest emitters in the real estate, in the construction sector, emerging technologies do exist. And the biggest developers of the future need to know about the leading technologies today to help them enter the supply chain so that they can be available 5 to 7 years from now, where they're at commercial scale, relevant for building. So the way we organize on the consulting side is to say, this is what we see in the world today. This is how the system needs to change from breaking ground all the way through to operating. These are the pathways that you can choose and learn more about to enter your supply chain and value chain down the road. And here are other partners that can help you along that track.
So
So
that's
one of the things
a lot of development or ground up. It sounds like. What about pre-existing? I heard you're consulting for pre-existing buildings as well. What are some of the ways you're implementing those processes?
Well, on pre-existing buildings, we're working with experts in the field like Owen, Joel, and yourself. So that's more on the asset management side, where we're trying to help generate an inflow of resources towards a 100% decarbonization strategy. So look, we're not sitting in buildings and converting them. We're relying on experts like yourselves that have been doing this, but subscale. And how do we figure out a way to communicate to the asset owners that this is a pathway that makes sense, that meets their fiduciary commitments, but also meets their decarbonization commitments? And
So Hari, on
how do
that
we help those flows happen?
on that note, I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about, strategy, potential investors. Everybody seems pretty excited, but there's I would say, a decent amount of skepticism about being one of the first investors. Do you think that once sort of this model is displayed at a bigger scale than what we're doing now, that the flow of funds will kind of be unlocked? Are you optimistic that it's just, a little bit of skepticism to be a first mover, but once that happens, it's going to be a bit of a tsunami? Or where do you kind of stand on how quickly funds will flow to solve these problems?
Well, there's two questions in there. So I absolutely am an optimist and think that the tsunami is going to flow. How quickly is a different question. So I think once this is demonstrated, and we've seen this in sustainability transition aspects in other asset classes, it's really difficult to get the first technologies and movement happening. It's hard for asset owners to make the decision. Everybody wants to be first to be, people say they want to be first to be second. That's bullshit, right? People want to be first to be fifth. They want to see it proven again, proven a third time, see the returns, and then they want to come in sort of at number 4 and number 5 because it's risk adjusted at that point, and they can see what the returns are going to look like.
And still
What we need to do is find those people that are willing to be first or second, right? And they do exist out there as well. But I do think once it's proven, once we can demonstrate and compare side to side against conventional real estate, especially in an interest rate environment like we have today, and especially with some of the incentives that we have through U.S. federal regulations, the IRA in particular, when we can stand up the returns that look the same or better, there's going to be an absolute tsunami of followers.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to talk real estate, and we appreciate, Hari, people like yourself and your consulting business doing what you're describing, educating, nurturing, bringing people along the journey. But it's been a theme of the show. We've had some great guests. We had this guy, Ari Matuziak. He runs Rewiring America, really focused on electrification. He was deeply involved in the Inflation Reduction Act. We mentioned Jigar Shah here. We talked to Brendan Wallace recently, a VC at Fifth Wall. And we've talked to Stacy Smedley. She's an expert on the embodied carbon of ground up and the materials in our value chain. So I say this to describe there's optimism in real estate. There's a lot of really smart people. There's a lot of attention. Even the biggest offenders of environmental footprint in real estate have probably some kind of net zero commitment on their website. So all good things to point to. But like you said, it takes a long time. And even if you're going to do a ground up project and you start design today, by the time that thing gets installed, there probably could have been a net zero concrete replacement you could have used if you thought about it from the beginning. So I guess, I'm not asking you to not be optimistic here, but is there a concern, especially on real estate, that because these cycles take so long and these decisions are baked so well in advance to how fast technology is moving, that we're not moving fast enough, specifically on real estate. I know maybe you just described how other asset classes had this curve happen. So maybe you can tell me why I shouldn't be pessimistic here.
Look, it's easy to be pessimistic across the board, right? I mean, in terms of the timeline you're talking about, we should have started all of this in 1972 in Stockholm when people realized that climate and biodiversity loss was a problem. And then 20 years passed and we had the Rio Summit in 1992. We still didn't do anything. I mean, we're 50 years too late for everything that we're talking about. The reason I'm optimistic, though, is that if we can see a pathway between 3 and 7 years from today, because the awareness is getting to a point where people are starting to make that shift. You mentioned Brandon and Fifth Wall. Like Fifth Wall didn't exist 5 years ago. It couldn't exist 5 years ago. Their climate fund, right? But it exists today. That to me is hope
signal. Yeah,
it's a huge signal, right? And if it takes us another 5 to 7 years, that's much faster than the 50 years we've been waiting since Stockholm, right?
Quit being so pessimistic, Joel.
Come on, Joel.
Well, another question. I'm gonna. This is gonna be slightly pessimistic. This show is called the Climate Rebels Podcast. Our business, as you referenced, is a real estate focused business that's trying to address the climate crisis as well as generate wealth. But we're all environmentalists here, and we have various perspectives of how we got to where we are as environmentalists. I know nature comes up consistently here on the show with not only ourselves but our guests. You just mentioned biodiversity loss, and seems to be gaining steam in the world of sustainability as, okay, maybe we've solved something on climate. There's enough intergovernmental panels and massive commitments to climate, but not so much on biodiversity. And there's things happening that I'm not even aware of that hopefully you can educate us on here. But you come from Conservation International, you talk seahorses, but here we are, Climate Rebels Podcast. I know it's all related, but maybe for the guests, how do you balance where you focus your attention and your emphasis when you're meeting with people who come to you and say, hey, Hari, I don't know. I have a lot of money and I want you to tell me what to do with it. Do you say biodiversity? Do you say climate? Where do you start?
He usually starts with the Raven. He discusses Raven and all of us here. But what do you talk about second?
Yeah, what are choices
Besides
2,
that.
3, 4, and 5?
Fair enough. So our approach is really to meet people where they are and understand what their values and passions are, and then drive them to the solutions that make the most sense, that are going to have a material shift for that transition. Okay. And that can be climate, that can be biodiversity, that can be water, that can be energy, that can be waste management, circular economy. It can be a whole bunch of different things. And look, we have a very interesting perch seeing across multiple systems, multiple asset classes, multiple sectors, and multiple technologies. So we can make those linkages fairly quickly. I will say this though. So I talked about Stockholm and Rio. One of the biggest mistakes we made as a global society was to separate the Biodiversity Convention from the Climate Convention in 1992 at the Earth Summit, because climate and biodiversity and nature are intrinsically linked. And if we look at the evolution of the Framework Convention on Climate Change on one hand and the Convention of Biological Diversity on the other, they were taking parallel paths for a long time, and we're trying to bring them together now. But the reality is that they're both massive, unwieldy things. We think about Dubai coming up later this year. There's going to be, I think the latest numbers are 75, 80,000 people talking about climate in Dubai. I was in Montreal in December as part of the Canadian delegation to the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's 18,000 people there. So it's hard to bring all of those people together to talk about something even more complex, the integration of nature and climate. But I think we did a great disservice in the
That's the conference of parties. So COP, there's a COP for biodiversity, there's a COP for climate, right? Just trying to make sure the audience is following along here. The COP for biodiversity, the one you just went to in Montreal, you said, how often, how many times has that happened?
So it happens every 2 years. And the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties, happens every year. So again, for context, the Conference of the Parties, the parties to the convention are governments, right? Governments signed up in 1992 in Rio and saying sustainable development that was a Sustainable Development Summit. It's important. We're going to set up a bunch of conventions, 2 of which were the Framework Convention on Climate Change that meets every year, and the Convention of Biological Diversity that meets every 2 years. We don't hear that much about biodiversity, but December was a watershed moment where we came up with something called the Global Biodiversity Framework. And in the Global Biodiversity Framework, what the parties to the convention agreed upon was that we should set aside 30% of the planet for nature, so protect 30% of the planet. restore habitat critical habitat that's been destroyed. So that's another 30%, and then sustainably manage the rest. So it's essentially 100% solution for a nature positive future. Now that's going to be really hard because the economy for the last 100 years around the world has been an extractive economy. Back to that number I talked about in 2011, right? Over half of global GDP is being spent actively destroying the planet. And that's kind of on purpose. Colonial powers set up structures that made the economy function on extraction. The whole purpose of getting people on land in North America was about raping, pillaging, and not only people, but the land, right? It was complete destruction of everything. And in fact, in most jurisdictions around the world, you can't actually protect land because it's not seen as a use of property. So the government can take away land if you're going to just conserve, even though there's an active sort of management that you can do to conserve and restore land. So our whole economy is based on this extractive notion. And what happened in Montreal in December was to kind of potentially start to shift the narrative, which is if we need to have a 100% solution around being nature positive as a planet, is there a pathway for us to recognize the underlying value of nature and to treat it as a true asset? The other piece that's really fascinating is the flip side to the 45 trillion being spent actively destroying the planet is that Vivid Economics, a McKinsey group, along with the World Economic Forum, and this has been corroborated through the Dasgupta Review and a few other sources, have estimated the amount of global GDP that relies on nature as its fundamental building block for value creation. And those reports talk about over half of global GDP being reliant on nature. I would argue that 100% of global GDP relies on nature as a fundamental building block. So take these things together for a second. We built a global economy where we only value the extraction of the very basis of value creation. You're all entrepreneurs, you run businesses, you understand how sort of basic economics works. Is there any long-term business model where you can erode the underlying asset base and expect long-term continual growth? That's impossible. So we need to fix that.
Hari, with the two stats that you threw out, we need to protect 30% and rewild the other 30. I don't know the terminology you used. What do you know? What percentage of land humans have affected to date, like of the total surface of the world? Are we still under that 60% threshold, or do we have to rewild places that we've fucked up?
So here's another fascinating thing, right? Is that we have this perception that nature is wild and pristine in wherever, right? The middle of Papua New Guinea or the middle of the Brazilian Amazon, southern Guyana. One of the first things I learned when I was doing my master's at Oxford University is I had a professor named Kathy Willis. She's a long-term ecologist. And what she told me was that there's no square kilometer of this planet that hasn't been affected by humans in some form. If you take a long-term core in the middle of the depths of Papua New Guinea, you'll find evidence of seed dispersal from human populations. You'll find evidence of fire. You'll find evidence of agriculture. Every portion of this planet's been affected by people. And we have this notion that people aren't part of this planet as a part of nature, but that's absolutely false. I mean, take Australia, for example, right? Australia has been a human-dominated landscape for tens of thousands of years, or thousands of years. This whole fire regime that we talk about and the hot fires coming in Australia, the primary reason for that is because we removed traditional owners, the indigenous people of Australia, from the land where they were controlled burning. The fuel load kind of increases because that controlled burning has stopped and the ecosystem is trying to rebalance itself. But the fires are a result not because of nature not being natural, it's because people have been taken off the landscape doing what they've been doing for the last several thousand years. So I think what we need to do is think about the integration of people within nature rather than people sit over here and destroy stuff and nature's over here and it's going to be pristine. That's all bullshit.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it.
We're a little running out of time. I mean, like this nature thread, I'd love to keep going on. So we'll have to have you back, Hari, because one of the questions I have, our business model, we started talking to you about ZNE 5 years ago, probably. You were one of the first people I thought of when Owen and I linked up on using real estate as a climate venture. And it was so obvious to us, and it continues to be. Look, the price of solar continues to plummet. This is just opportunistic. This is acknowledging trends. We can say impact, and we're driven by impact, of course, but we can talk to investors or people who care about real estate and say, look, this is cheaper energy. Put the solar in your building efficiently, and this is a good business model. I struggle to think just right now. I'm sure you have lots of things you could tell me. Um, if you're going to try to capitalize on what happened in December at the nature-based conference of parties, what's the business models of the future that haven't been thought of yet, where entrepreneurs can say, I can make money, we can make money, we can do better for people's finances while also protecting nature?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't have a clear answer to that today. I mean, I've got some ideas. So, the world in Montreal and since has been thinking a lot about nature-based credits or biodiversity credits as analogs to carbon credits. So I think there's a potential pathway to commodify biodiversity. It needs to be really well thought out, and there needs to be, we need to address issues of additionality and fungibility and all sorts of things. There's a potential pathway there. What I truly believe is that we need to value the underlying asset base, though. What I am really pushing for is governments and businesses around the world to recognize that nature is producing most of the economic value in the world, but it's not appearing on the balance sheet anywhere. So how do we figure out a way to recognize on the balance sheet the tremendous asset value that nature has and put its rightful place in the global economy? And that's where I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to protect, restore, and have that 100% solution for the planet, but also for long-term economic progress. It's going to be hard.
Yeah,
but
that's a big challenge.
That's the vision.
Big challenge, big opportunities. Another theme of the Climate Rebels podcast here. And it's, we're all pretty busy on social media. As you know, our business model right now, we've shifted from when we talked to you about working with some of your larger scale investors to now trying to raise money from individuals. And so we all probably spend too much time on social media than it's good for us. But it's interesting. Oh, and I know we've talked about this. Whenever we post something about nature, even though it's not like directly related to our business model, those posts do incredibly well. And we're trying to educate someone on climate change. They don't. So it seems pretty obvious, right? But we have really clear data right in front of us now that show us that people care about nature. That's for sure. That's pretty crosses a lot of
people get it,
traditional barriers.
right? People get deforestation. People get no more rhinos in Africa, but they don't get tons of carbon.
Invisible gas.
It's less tangible.
That's tough.
I'd counter that, though. I mean, the amount of funding going towards climate is much greater than the amount of funding going towards biodiversity loss.
Well, maybe at the institutional level, but we're now in this retail place where we're putting out a lot of TikTok videos and Instagram videos. And so for the general public that aren't really educated on all things climate and biodiversity related, I think anecdotally, it seems like people grasp onto biodiversity better than like greenhouse gases, carbon, etc.
Yeah. And you can see it. It's cool, right? Like a seahorse or a tiger or a jaguar or a gorilla.
Orcas. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how much weight a counter from somebody from Oxford holds anyway. So
Not much.
not quite.
It's a safety school.
Well, Hari, you're because you're on the Climate Rebels podcast, you're now going to be on TikTok. I hope you're aware of that. So I'm going to give you a soundbite here. Help us educate our TikTok audience. You're in the front lines of this. You're talking to the investors, you're talking to the businesses, you're talking to the governments. I've always enjoyed learning from you, as we are here right now, but help our audience learn. Let's talk climate specifically. What do you see as the real solutions? Is this insurmountable? I gather you're someone who's another theme of the show. Less talk, more action. So tell us how we get this done.
Absolutely. Let's talk more action. I think what you all are doing in real estate is a great start, right? The economics are working out better than ever before. The asset class is heavily emitted. So 40% of global emissions comes from the built environment. If we can eliminate those, we're well on our path for a climate positive future. And the sound bites I'll leave you with is, we have a lot of segmentation in our industry. We have a lot of animosity. We have the ESG deniers. We have, the world is very polarized at the moment. But what I would say is that through our experience working across sectors is that we have much more in common than we think. And we all have values that typically align in some way that makes sense for the climate positive future and a nature positive future. At the end of the day, if we can focus more on our similarities, we can get further ahead. The second thing I would say is that Trade-offs do often exist, but not nearly at the scale that we've thought of in the past. It's not the case that we can either make a lot of money through destruction, or we can help the planet and people and not make any money. There's a lot of middle ground, and what you guys are doing in the real estate space is part of that middle ground. You can make a lot of money and decarbonize residential real estate now.
Yeah.
We can go and do that at scale right now. We can make more money than conventional and sort of extracted real estate propositions. So let's go do that at the $1 trillion scale that is available to us, right? And then the final thing I'll say is that context is key. A lot of people don't want to be the first in because they don't understand what they're doing and they don't understand the context. At the end of the day, if you understand that there are certain things that are going to be different than what you've done in your past, but they're surmountable, it's about understanding where people are, what they're doing, who the communities are, how they engage, what risk actually looks like and how to manage that risk, then we can get ahead of these things. If you say no just because I haven't done it before, then we're not going to get anywhere. If you say, maybe let's try to figure out how to overcome these things that I'm worried about because I haven't done it before, then we can make progress. And the only way we do that is by communicating with the people at the front lines on the ground that are facing these things day to day and learning from them.
Well said as always, Hari. Well,
Definitely.
we always start the show with the first question and we end the show with the same question. So we try to talk me out of some pessimism here today. Here on the show, we try to avoid the doomsdayers out there saying that this challenge is insurmountable, but we try to focus on the disruptors and the entrepreneurs and the doers like yourself and the people you work with, Hari. So tell us, what gives you hope for the future?
I think 3 things. So one is the momentum we're seeing with some of these regulatory things passing in Europe, in the US, and hopefully soon in Canada where I live. 2 is the young people. I think you had a shout out last podcast or last month, Joel, to some of the next generation that are coming up and speaking about these issues in a very articulate and a very powerful way. And I think the next generation I'm really encouraged by because they're not only saying things, they're doing things, and they're making waves by moving with their actions and their feet and where they want to sit and be employed in the future. I think that's critical. And the third thing is we don't have to convert everything, right? So at the end of the day, we also have numbers that show us that to alleviate the biodiversity crisis, the Paulson report told us it's a $711 billion annual challenge. More than half of that comes from perverse subsidies that exist today, that if we just converted into positive subsidies for nature, we could get pretty close. And the remainder is a couple of $100 billion in private capital that needs to go toward a nature positive future. So what gives me hope is that we don't have to convert the 45 trillion. We just have to get a few $100 billion working in a positive way, and we'll make a tremendous strides toward, what we all want, which is a climate nature positive future where humanity can thrive.
Making it sound so easy. I love it.
Yeah, huh?
Well, we'll close out on that, Hari. Thank you so much for joining. Again, we'd love to have you back. I know there's so much international experience that we'd love to learn from. We've pretty much been a pretty U.S. focused podcast so far, and I know you have this amazing international experience, not just from your days in Conservation International, but in what you're doing now from a business perspective. So let's have you back. But before we let you go, how do we find you? How do we learn more about EcoAdvisors, EcoInvestors Capital, websites, social media? Tell the audience.
Just ecoadvisors.org, ecoinvestors.capital are the websites. We're on all the socials. Just Google and you'll find different things that we say, mostly about the transition pathways, the fact that humans and nature are connected and we need to work harder for the future of humanity. Thanks very much. This has been super fun. Really appreciate the conversation and letting me drone on these issues that I could work on constantly, but don't get to talk about as much as I'd like. I'd love to come back on if you have room for me.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hari.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. You can find us on most of the social media platforms at Join Raven. So that's Join, and Raven is with a Y, RAYVEN. You can find this podcast and more great content at joinraven.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to fight the climate crisis?